Welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Muntz. Is it possible that removing gendered language from the choral rehearsal solves the problem of gender identity, gender expression, and inclusion of all students? Some suggest that it does. Is it also possible that solution doesn't solve the problem? Maybe it's just one step of many. Maybe it's one approach of many. Is there room for nuance in this conversation? I definitely believe there is. In fact, I am of the mind that there is always room for nuance. There is always room for the exploration of a topic that assumes that there is some truth hidden in the corner of every perspective. In this conversation, I will be bouncing ideas off of a person who's a little bit of a different type of guest for me so far on the show, in that it's not a choral director. This is a person who has a lot of experience singing in choir as a trans man and trans baritone, someone who has sung in choir on the alto part and also is learning now to sing baritone. I thought that would be a really good perspective to bring into this conversation. So in just a little bit, I will bring you my conversation with Theo Wren. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about how I am using Sight Reading Factory right now. This episode is going up mid-May, and it's getting close to the end of our school year. And one of the things we do in our program at Lee Summit High School is we test every single student individually in sight singing. The way we do this is that when they come into the program at the beginning of 9th grade, we do a pretest. That pretest looks like a level 2, level 3, maybe sight singing exercise on Sight Reading Factory set in a really comfortable key, just to gauge how that student's prior knowledge might look. Some students struggle even to sing a scale, just to acclimate themselves to the key, all the way to kids who a level 2 or 3 as coming in a 9th grader is already super easy for them. So we do a pretest to establish a starting place. For some kids, if they are brand new to singing a cappella by themselves, that assignment or that pretest could establish that, hey, by the end of the semester, you need to be able to sing a scale. For some kids, it allows us to set a level for their Sight Reading Factory. And then once we get to their final, they test that level. And that means they do it by themselves. And then every semester after that they're in choir, they must bump up a level. And I've discovered that accountability for improvement has gone light years in our program for causing kids to go out and seek opportunities to practice and work on their own to read music. So I strongly encourage Sight Reading Factory, and just thought I'd offer a tip of a way to assess your students using Sight Reading Factory in a way that has been very successful for us. And of course, feel free to shoot me an email, choralosophy@gmail.com, if you'd like me to explain any further about how we grade those sight reading exams or any of those types of questions. I'd be happy to answer those for you. But head over to sightreadingfactory.com and order for next school year. Get your account set up for each of your students and for you so that you can rock out some extremely awesome music literacy software. Just be sure to enter Choralosophy at checkout to get your 10% discount. And on an order with lots of students involved, that's a big savings. And while you're thinking ahead to next school year, make sure you are heading over to ryanmain.com to check out some of his awesome arrangements and original compositions. I really think there is some stuff on his website that are hidden gems in the choral profession, the choral world, that you've probably heard at some conventions, but he self-publishes, so definitely trying to get the word out about his music. Especially for younger voices, I feel, although he does have some more advanced things on there. But if you've got that beginning high school choir or really, really good junior high choir, his music is going to be an instant hit with your kids, and they're going to dive into it and get so much meat off the bones, so to speak. So as you're planning your literature choices for next year, head over to ryanmain.com. Strongly recommend his Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel for tenor bass voices. It's just an awesome arrangement, and my kids did it last year for contest and just had a blast with it. So check that out and enter Choralosophy at checkout to get 10% off. I'm here with Theo Wren, a freelance musician, composer, multi-instrumentalist, gigger around Kansas City. I've known Theo for quite a few years, all the way back to our UMKC days in the choir program, and I thought I'd have him come on and talk a little bit about um, some of the topics that musicians might come across as it relates to being trans, interacting with trans people, and trying to learn more about, I guess that you could say, the brave new world that we're in as it relates to understanding different types of people. That I know for old people like me who are almost 40, were just conversations that we didn't have in my 20s and teens. And so we're trying to learn more about that today. So welcome, Theo.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. It's going great. I've just set my children up with their Netflix babysitter downstairs so that we can chat for a little while.
Cool. Yeah, got to keep them occupied, yeah?
like, and mostly keep them quiet while we're doing a podcast.
Right.
That's important. We might hear my dog at some point too. She likes to interrupt. But we'll just ignore her
That's all right.
for a little while.
Never fault a dog.
That's right. So tell the audience a little bit about you. What's your background, not only as a musician but just as a person who's developed and changed and gotten you to where you are.
Well, I mean, my name's Theo, as we all know. I'm just a musician from Kansas City. I've been playing piano since I was maybe 3 years old. I kind of taught myself watching my dad, and I started singing as well. Started voice lessons maybe when I was like 15 or so,
Hmm.
and stuff like that. I just have always been interested in music, but um one thing that relates to the trans thing, I'm also a trans guy. So, binary trans guy, pronouns he and him, so there's that. um One thing I noticed with my singing is, for some reason, I was just always really disturbed, when I was asked to sing high, and I had no idea why.
Hmm.
See, I didn't know right away that I was trans. I knew that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it.
Uh-huh. When did you know?
I mean, I didn't actually just accept it fully until like 2 years ago.
Okay.
So, but before then there were signs, and it's kind of, the realization is not really something that comes all at once for everyone. You know,
Right.
some kids will know when they're like 4 years old that they're supposed to be a boy or a girl when they're assigned the opposite. But for me, like, it was a lot of rationalization of just feelings and thoughts that I could not explain.
Have you ever tried to pin down your earliest memory of when what, so tell us about that.
Well, I remember, I mean, I was probably about 2 years old, and, I remember my mom was, like, having me stand in front of the mirror and, like, see who I was and stuff, just kind of introducing me to, like, how I looked and all that, and I remember the first thing I noticed was just there was something about it that I didn't like, and, I mean, that sounds like, "Oh, I must have thought I was hideous or something," but I didn't. I
Uh,
was just more like, there's something off about that, and I could not explain it.
uh-huh.
She was trying to get me to, like, call myself a big girl and all this stuff and, being, like, all nice and encouraging, but I wouldn't say anything, I just stared because something was just kinda off. And
Hmm.
then, a couple years later, there was I remember sitting on my bed and just kinda thinking, and it finally clicked in my head that I was a girl and not a boy, or at least that's what everyone was telling me. And I remember being actually really disappointed and kind of mad about it.
Huh. Did,
And
that's yeah. I'm just wondering too if you, because did you ever go through a phase in your life where you, um, and maybe this would be only something you would have known looking back on it, but where you uh, kind of swung the other direction and through a super girly phase at all to try to like cement that in yourself, or has it always just been a ew, gross, this is not for me kind of a?
I kinda went back and forth, 'cause see, I mean, I do like certain aesthetics that are considered feminine, I do like to put on eyeliner, things like that, which was further confusing, and it was even more confusing because I still had, got crushes on boys. I didn't know that you could be gay and trans, so there's that too. It was very
Hmm.
confusing. But yes, I did kinda, try to hyper feminize for a while, and I would go back and forth between, hyper girly and just not girly at all.
Right. Yeah. I only asked that question because in kind of my effort to understand somebody's position the best I can. I know we're told nowadays that like unless you live a certain identity, you can't ever understand it. But I get that. But at the same time, like you should try. you
Well,
know.
I mean, I
You
think
know.
there are certain, like, broad parallels that you can draw.
Right. Right. So I'm putting myself in the position of like if I was told as a kid that I am a certain thing,
Mhm.
and I like just in my heart didn't believe it, but yet everyone around me was telling me that that was true. Then I felt like I probably would go through a pendulum phase too, where I would be like if I well maybe if this is true about me, I'm just going to go full out. Like I'm going to go full out and try it and
Mhm.
see if and because I feel like that's a natural human reaction.
Well, yeah, I mean, you would kinda go back and forth and just see, because no matter what, that conflict is gonna be in you until
Hmm.
you accept it. And so, I did kinda go through this phase where I'm like, well, as far as I knew, everyone else was right, and you could not just change what you were, what the doctor told you that you were at birth, so, you know, and just kinda try to dress up in the pink and, girly stuff and
Right.
just try to fit the role, but it just never worked.
Yeah, it would probably seem to a kid as like the path of least resistance.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. Have you ever heard of the comedian Eddie Izzard?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, when you mentioned being gay and trans, in fact I just he was on Joe Rogan's podcast this week, and I listened to that episode just like hours ago while I was at the gym,
Mhm.
and he talked about well she depended he was interestingly because he it goes by Eddie, and the way he was explaining it to Joe Rogan was
Mhm.
that he has girl mode and boy mode, and he switches back and forth, and he uses male pronouns, but
Uh-huh.
yet is attracted to women, and
Right.
so he said wannabe lesbian. That's what he that's what he called. It.
Yeah.
Which and so I think that the moral of the story there, and it seems like a similar kind of experience from the other side is used like if you don't fit. I think that's actually one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this topic, because one of the things that we do when we talk through something is we kind of hone in on our own ideas as well as learning what somebody else's ideas are, and I feel
Right.
like one of the dangers of trying to putting people in these like easily definable boxes is
Mhm.
then it limits that expression, especially for children when they're trying to figure out who they are, and it's not even just about sex and gender. Like kids don't know who they are at
Right.
all.
Yeah.
And so forget about sexuality. It's like I don't even know if I like baseball or
Mhm.
whatever else. It's hard enough to be a kid rather than putting all those boxes on them.
Right, and just, some of the y like, there's this thing called transmasculine invisibility where, you see a lot of press about, like, trans women, which is awesome, and I love that, but you don't see nearly as much about trans men, and so, when I was a kid, I just thought, the only type of trans you could be was, like, assigned male and transitioning to female, and I thought that, like, the most you could be was, like, a really butch lesbian.
Right.
Yeah, like, I didn't realize when I was, like, 10 years old, I didn't know the difference between, like, a butch lesbian and a trans guy.
Do you have any theories about why that is? Why we seem to consume more media related to um, transitioning to female?
Probably well, what I have heard from, friends who are trans women is more like it's like it's more shocking somehow if a so-called man, dresses up as a woman than
Hmm.
like a if a so-called woman dresses up like a man. Because I mean, you think about it, we totally celebrate tomboys. Like we think of it as a really cute thing if like a girl dresses up in a suit and with a bow tie and all that. But if a guy dresses up in a dress, then that's so weird.
Yeah, yeah, I think I can see that. I have, I guess, I had never even thought of that that
Mhm,
invisibility issue that you just mentioned until right now. So
mhm,
this idea is not going to be very fleshed out. But
right.
I have a theory already, which is that it's possible that, and this is just from my observation of being alive for 40 years,
Mhm,
we are more used to seeing feminine men
mhm.
than we are masculine women. In
Yeah.
in I'm thinking about like uh, flamboyant gay male
Mhm,
entertainers and comedians, and that's a relatively, it's almost a meme to the point
mhm.
where we're used to that. We're used to that stereotype,
Right.
whereas we're a little bit less used to the kind of butch female stereotype. And so when a
Mhm.
man or when someone transitions to female, it's almost like a 21st century extension of that meme.
I
Um,
guess so, yeah. But I just wonder if, like, that visibility, in the first place, comes from it being kind of more shocking to general public.
oh yeah, I agree. I think you're dead on, and I think there's a that might, I don't know how much into like evolutionary biology and stuff you are. I'm kind of a nerd about it, but like
A
there's
little bit.
have you ever heard of the greater male variability hypothesis?
No, I don't think so. I probably have heard some of the principles, but I just don't know the
Yeah.
actual title.
Yeah, so it's been very well studied and documented in biology for years.
Mhm,
In all species on the planet,
mhm.
the male side of the spectrum um, tends to vary more in all of its characteristics, like
Mm.
size, hair color, eye color, level of muscle mass. There's a greater variability. It's the idea that you know it's why in a wolf pack, for example, there oftentimes is an alpha who's significantly more dominant than all the
Mm.
others, because there might be more, there might be fewer of those very dominant male wolves, but then there's quite a few that are really stupid and slow and, and dumb. Whereas the females of every species are more consistent.
You
Um,
know yeah.
and so
Sorry.
no, I was going to say, so that to kind of finish that thought, like my
Mhm,
thought then is if that's even kind of true, and there's quite a bit of science that says it
mhm,
is that if someone's transitioned to female, we're gonna be more a little bit less shocked because we already are used to that great variability of what men do
mhm.
and how men present and how men, uh, like I said, with the flamboyancy, maybe we're more used to that or whatever. Whereas like I said, I've never thought about this until 3 minutes ago, so I might be going out to left field, but it's
Well,
it's it's a thought.
I mean, that just makes me think, I wonder if that's why it's, generally harder for trans women to pass. Because,
Hmm.
if the world is going to see them as the women they are, well, then they're expecting a much smaller box
Ooh,
put
yeah.
women in. Yeah.
Uh huh.
Whereas, men have greater variance. And so, it's not quite as shocking to see, a 5'4", slim, small boned guy than like a 6-foot woman who has like,
Right.
stronger features.
That's interesting. It's like almost like to pass as a woman, you have a smaller target to hit. Um,
Yes.
it, yeah, and I think then you could also go into the or down the rabbit hole of the target is so small on that side because we have so many more images of women
Mhm.
we're used to seeing because males tend to be more visual
Mhm.
on average, and so we have a more crystal picture. And of course, this is something feminists have criticized
Oh,
for
yeah.
20, 20 or 30 years.
Oh,
the
I see.
idea of like what image do we get presented of what a female should look like. And so
Oh,
I think,
yeah.
yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think that makes a lot of sense. Um,
Mhm.
so I wonder, because I mean I could just nerd out on that for like an hour, but I want to
Right.
let's ask I want to ask you a little bit more about the music side of things, about how your life as a trans person has been affected, changed, um, or maybe still transitioning as you find your kind of identity as a musician. Um,
Mhm.
you know, because I know you've sung, like you said, you started taking voice lessons maybe when you were about 15,
Mhm.
and earlier you said you were not super into singing high. Uh,
Yeah.
so how what are some early singing memories that you might have that seem significant to you now that you're transitioning to be in that, now that your voice is becoming almost like a it's like a new voice that we would say almost sounds like a baritone to me right now. So
Yeah, that's what, my voice teacher has been telling me. That's probably what my voice will end up being.
uh-huh.
It's pretty cool. I like it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, you're gonna love it the way it sounds on the podcast. It's gonna be
oh, sweet.
great.
Awesome. Well, let's see. I mean, I remember being in high school and, having singing alto at first because that's what I was most comfortable with. Um, but my teacher noticed that I could hit high notes, and a lot of the other girls, or you know, assigned female, whatever, a lot of the other girls could not. So she wanted me to be like a second soprano, and I tried it, and for some reason I could not pinpoint why, but I would start like kind of choking up, trying to sing those high notes, and just if I thought about it too much, I would start tearing up, and I had no idea why. I was
Hmm.
just like, "This shouldn't upset me, it's just a different voice part." But, yeah, that and, just, like, having to wear dresses, in choir, I never liked that, you know, I kinda I kinda had to tune it out, I guess, because
Hmm.
there was no other way I could perform with the choir, I had to wear the uniform. But, yeah, like, those those kinda make me think maybe that was gender dysphoria.
So you think maybe that, like, looking back on it, those moments of tearing up or those moments of feeling like that, this is not my voice, was
Mhm.
kind of like your first, some of your first expressions of that inner kind of inner boy crying out.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, remember being so jealous of, like, girls, low altos who got to sing tenor. I used to be so jealous of them. And eventually, my senior year, I ended up being the one, alto 2 who was put on tenor because I fought for it basically.
Mm,
Kinda subtly, but, I would just kinda start singing the lower part, and
right.
eventually, I got put in that section, I was like, "Yes!"
Right.
But then there came a point where alto was not low enough for me.
Okay, and what do you mean? Tell me more about that. So it came to a point where alto's not low enough. Was
Mhm.
that in high school, and or was that like later when you were thinking about your transition more fully?
Well, this probably started in college,
Okay, 'cause
and
I remember you being a pretty darn good alto.
oh, thank you.
Mhm.
I mean, I liked singing alto. I kinda had a lot of pride in it for a while, but I think it was not so much, like, the alto part itself rather than, "Ooh, I can sing low," and I think that was just, my gender identity wanting to be externalized. It's just
Right.
like, "Your voice should be lower than this by now."
Yeah, yeah, and that's, I'm actually glad you said that. Maybe it wasn't the alto part itself, because I think,
Yeah.
like, I sing alto.
Mhm.
In contra, I sing alto a lot, and I
Mhm.
am as about as straight and cis as you can possibly be, and I
Mhm.
have a big old beard, and to me, it like the voice part in a choir is not gender related specifically. It's more about like what your voice can do.
Mhm.
And so, because I have a big old loud falsetto and I've taught girls for 15 years, I've developed a part of my voice that's easy and that's helpful in a choir and all that. So So when I think about kids, like the kids that I teach, I try to um, teach as much as I possibly can that concept, especially when I'm dealing with, like, let's say a 14-year-old boy whose voice hasn't changed yet. And
Mhm.
really, he's an alto or a soprano sometimes. And trying to destigmatize the idea that a boy would sing alto or that a girl would sing tenor or whatever, like to try to
Sure.
blur those lines, not because I've had, trans students. Actually, I communicated to you before that I actually haven't yet.
Mhm.
I've had people in my choirs that transitioned after high school, but
Oh,
never that, like, that I knew at the time. You know what I mean?
right.
Because in your case, like you said, you might not have known at that time either.
Mhm.
That's what you're going to do. So it's an interesting thing because if we try to divorce the specific idea that sopranos and altos are girls and tenors and basses are boys, uh,
Mhm.
then it could be that your kind of, you mentioned dysphoria at a
Mhm.
certain time of your life, might have felt easier because it might have been like, hey, I'm singing alto because that's where my voice is right now, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that I have to be a certain kind of girl. It's just,
Right.
you know what I mean?
And I mean, that's kind of one thing that bothered me when, the choir teacher would say, like, "Okay, ladies, we need to sing this," when they're referring to sopranos and altos. I'm just like, "But I'm not a girl." Or like, they'd say, "All right, men, sing this," when they mean tenors and basses.
Uh-huh.
I know it's like more of a shortcut than just saying sopranos and altos or, upper voices, lower voices, I don't know. And I don't know. I think it would be better if you just called them like upper voices or lower voices or something like that that's not gendered. Because not only, are there people who are kind of dysphoric about their voices, but there are trans people who don't want to go on hormones, who, are or who are just happy with their voices as they are, and it doesn't mean that they're a certain gender because of where their voice is.
Right.
It's like you're saying, but I mean, that can carry into adulthood too.
Hmm. Yeah. The way I think about that, I like just the way I approach everything is that um, I never believe in one step fixes for things.
Mhm.
Meaning, I don't think it's ever that simple. So, for example, if I had I think if I was in front of a high school choir of 100 kids, where I wasn't 100% sure that, like, I guess knowing some background about each of those kids and kind of what makes them tick, and have had individual conversations with them, then
Mhm.
I would be more likely to do what you're suggesting, which would be to
Mhm.
try to, say sopranos and altos. Let's try this, and especially because I do have occasionally some boys who will sing alto or whatever,
Right.
and so to try to just make that as general as possible for lots of reasons, but that's one of the reasons. But if I was in front of a choir where I knew the kids really well, and I knew that I had a choir of 16 girls who
Mhm.
identify as girls, you know,
Well, yeah, I mean,
so I think it's a case for me. It's a case by case. It's like,
right.
it's a thing where if I had a trans student, like I said before, a couple times, I haven't yet, but
Mm.
if I did, absolutely, like absolutely. In fact, I remember singing. I remember singing in a choir where, for the very first time in my life, there was a male countertenor
Mhm.
singing in the alto section, and he would, cisgendered and identified as a man, but sang alto, and
Right.
like I now do. I hadn't done that at the time, but
Sure.
and the director would sometimes just by default say, you know, ladies, let's try this, and he
And
would
of course,
usually,
people probably laugh.
yeah, I would laugh, and he'd kick back with some kind of snarky, like, comment about, yeah, sure, us ladies, we're going to try this, and I found that comforting, because at the same time it's like, yeah, language is tricky because we get our synapses are formed for language at a very, very early age, and so like, trying to flip flop back and forth between these things are tricky unless you have some kind of an anchor. And
Hmm.
so for me, like that anchor is my students. Like it's the kids in front of me, or the singers in front of me, that would be my anchor of like, what kind of language code am I going to use now? So it's a way to think about that, because I agree with you in the sense that if you have somebody in a choir um, who would be being put in a box that they don't want to be in, that could be a thing that would cause like all kinds of thoughts to spew in their head that they don't need to be thinking about, because we're really should be thinking about music.
Right, and that's one reason why, I guess I'm kinda going off into, like, choir uniforms right now, but that is one reason why I quit a choir, because they did not do this before. They didn't have, like, specific uniforms for everyone to wear before, but then, like, one year, they decided they wanted to do that, and so all the sopranos and altos had dresses, and they wanted to put me into a dress.
Hmm.
And I'm just and not only that, but this choir sings, really difficult rap. And I was just like, I won't be able to think about what I'm singing if I feel like I'm dressing in drag, if I'm in a costume.
Right.
Oh. And I mean it wouldn't and then that's not to say that like guys can't wear dresses or anything like that. It's a little different for a trans guy because that is something that he has kind of been, forced into for his whole life.
And working really hard to get out of.
Yes, exactly.
Uh-huh.
If it was, if I were a cis guy, putting on a dress would not be nearly as like upsetting, I guess. And I think, it's not that way so much now that I'm, passing as a guy and I sound like a guy, or like a cis guy, I suppose. But back then, I had not even transitioned yet, so it just kind of felt like, "Ah, here we go again."
Right. I'm definitely, I think I'm actually more hardline in agreement with you on the uniform thing,
Mhm,
because like I'm a little bit, I'm kind of a language purist. And
mhm,
so it's a little bit harder for me. Like I said, on the language side of things, like I want to go case by case, and I want to get to know my students individually, and
mhm.
try to destigmatize the language rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater and never use phrases like ladies or gentlemen and guys, because the reality is a lot of people identify as those things.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I think those are words that there's nothing negative about those words. They're just descriptors. But with the uniform thing, to me, that for choir directors, that's an easy fix. you
Yes.
you just you just say in your handbook or your syllabus or whatever, that this ensemble wears tuxedos and dresses. You choose one of those two.
Yeah.
And I've seen people come up with the idea of having entirely gender neutral uniforms, but I think that's not maybe even a necessary step if you allow people to choose.
Right. I mean, just, concert black has always worked.
Hmm.
So, I mean, why not just do that?
Right. Yeah. If there are people, like for example, the tradition at my school is that our kids in the chamber choir wear a tuxedo, and the guys wear a tuxedo and the ladies wear a dress. And I've never changed the language in the actually in our current handbook. It doesn't mention gender at all. It just I think people just assume it,
Mhm.
because again, if you're cisgendered and you see it, you read, and all of your friends are, and you
Mhm.
read a document that says this ensemble wears a tux and a dress, or tux or a dress. The tux cost X dollars and the dress cost X dollars. Then people just assume they know which one there is.
Right.
What I think I'm going to do next year, just because I've been thinking about this more lately, is that I'm gonna specify that there is an option for you to choose the one that makes you the most comfortable.
Sure.
Because it's kind of about soon, in a little bit, I'm going to be doing an episode on the show called or talking about an article called "What's on Our Choral Welcome Mats."
Okay.
And just a little signal like that to me could be that future trans student that I someday will have, surely,
Mhm.
might read that document, and just by seeing that one little sentence would
Mhm.
might be the difference between them trying out and not.
Right, and I think, especially, like, this generation of kids, it's gonna be a more common thing because, I mean, we've always had trans people, it's just that almost none have felt comfortable enough, in their teenage years to express it. But
Hmm.
but now it's becoming a much more accepted thing, so you definitely will see trans kids.
Yeah, I mean, almost all my colleagues have.
Mhm,
I'm not sure why I haven't come across that before, but
mhm.
but I think it has to do more with the, like you said, like the teenageness of it. Um,
Right.
it's the same thing with kids coming out as being gay or lesbian or bi. A lot of times they don't know. Like I'll know before they do.
Yeah.
And then like I'll see a Facebook post a year after they graduate where they've come out, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, welcome to the club because I knew that when you were 14 or whatever.
Aw, yeah.
And so it's an interesting thing, but I think you're right that teenagers nowadays are um, they're they're more and more open to the conversation, which I
Oh,
think it's like I said at the beginning of this episode. That's we're having conversations now that we weren't able to have before. Do you
yeah.
do you ever think that on the topic of having the conversations, do you ever come across any barriers to the conversation that just come about because of those language codes? Like, do you feel like there's ever situations where conversations get shut down because people don't use the wrong or don't use the right language?
To be honest, I'm pretty forgiving about it. I don't expect everybody to have you know, all of the related terminology down, because a lot of it is very new to most people and a lot of it was new to me,
Hmm.
so I mean, we just use what we have. But, and people are just gonna learn as they go. It's not something you can just all learn all in one sitting. So, I really don't it really doesn't bother me. As long as I know they're making an effort, then that's fine, you know?
Yeah, I think that's how it should be.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think if you there's a certain amount of um, I guess you could say probably from social media a certain amount of virtue signaling that happens
Yes.
where if someone sees someone use the wrong words or the wrong way of describing a person or whatever, then that's an opportunity to put that person in their place.
Oh, that's
And
just I think that's absolutely horrible. I mean, and I've seen so much of it. I'm sorry to, like, cut you off.
oh no, I want to hear. I wanted to hear what you see about that. I know what I've seen already.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's almost cult-like the way that, some of these people on social media behave. And I mean, I'm very outspoken about just not doing that because I mean, that's going to alienate people who want to learn and that's going to make the rest of us look bad. I don't want to be somebody who walks into a room and whom people know is a people know me as a trans guy and then they're just like, oh god, I have to walk on eggshells around this guy. I don't want that. I want people to be respectful, and that doesn't really need a whole lot of effort. Just don't like deliberately call me ma'am or something. But I don't expect everybody to just tiptoe around me. And I don't wanna be that type of person, and I see a lot of these people, they're not even part of the community. They're, like, cis, straight people from, like, universities maybe, and
Right.
and I mean and they just it's like they just took a gender studies class, and now they're super excited about it.
To
They
show
wanna
what they've
talk.
learned.
Exactly, it's more
Yeah.
about them, it's not
Yeah.
about justice, it's about controlling people and showing off, and, I mean, that really upsets me because it really needs to be about justice and not, showing flaunting your ego.
Yeah, I agree, and I see the same thing, and it makes me really sad, especially because, I'll tell you a story real quick about,
Mhm.
of course, because I'm close to 40. the issue when I was in my teens that was the big issue around acceptance and understanding and all of that was just homosexuality. So
Yeah.
not related to gender expression so much. That was not even a conversation we really had back then, at least that I was ever exposed to. But it was just about whether or not it's okay to be gay.
Right. I
You
mean, well,
know,
that's, it's kind of still in the ballpark, but, it's just
it is,
another.
but it's more accepted now. It's more accepted now by a lot
Right.
than when I would than in 1997 or 96 in a small town in Missouri.
Yeah.
And so the my experience with that was I was raised in a super conservative Christian church
Mhm.
where flat out being gay meant you're going to hell.
Oh,
We love everyone, but of course we're going to try to teach them to not be gay because we love them.
yeah.
If they die while still gay, they'll they'll go to hell, and and all of that. And so I was taught to believe that being a gay person was akin to being a sinner of kind of one of the highest orders.
Yeah,
Um,
and, I mean, I was kinda, introduced to a church that was like that too for a while, you
yeah,
know? I mean, my parents, they've learned since then, they don't, they're totally accepting of me now, but for a while, they were into the same kinda thing, and so I bet that influenced how I grew up, but yeah,
yeah, and it did a lot of people in my generation. And what was interesting was, I'm a very headstrong, stubborn person, and
mhm,
so I had been raised in that environment, and I bought into it when I was a teenager. Like I was not ever hateful because I was taught to be loving,
mhm,
and I would speak with kindness to anyone, but I would always explain that what you're doing is not according to the Bible or whatever, and
mhm.
that whole thing. And because had been raised to think that way, and so then my first exposure to a gay person who did not fit that narrative was my high school choir teacher.
Oh, yeah?
And he back at that in that time, you weren't really out per se, but people knew. Like it wasn't something
Right,
you talked about, but everybody kind of knew. And
right.
and he was my hero.
Mhm.
And I looked at him every day in class and looked up to him, and he was kind and compassionate, and was such a great teacher. And then I started, like, I'd go to church and I'd hear more stuff about how gay people were bad, and there was this cognitive dissonance that started to happen where I'm like, but he's not bad,
Right,
and and
exactly.
and he's actually really good, and like I love talking to him, and I never feel threatened, and I like he's just a really good teacher, and not to mention a really good singer and choir director, and I want to be one of those someday, and
Yeah.
all of this. And I was like, this can't be true. Like one of these things has to be not true. Either my teacher is pretending to be awesome,
Mhm.
or what I'm learning in my church is wrong. And so one of my fears about the way that this all these social media conversations are happening now is that I dread to think what would have happened had Facebook been around when I was an 17 or 18-year-old kid wrestling with this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Because if someone had jumped out at me, like if I made a post on Facebook about how being gay was wrong, and then a bunch of people jumped on to tell me how evil and bigoted I was, I
Ugh,
prob I
that'd be
probably
horrible.
I probably would have dug my heels in, because I'm stubborn, and I
Mhm.
would have probably, like, for years and years after that, never changed. My heart would not have softened,
Right.
but the reason that it did was because I was treated with love by a person who was, according to my upbringing, was someone who wasn't worthy of love. And
Oh, yeah.
and so I feel like when we have these conversations on social media, there's no room for that, which is unfortunate because I think a lot of people are digging their heels in on
Yes.
things because the first instinct we have is to signal how wrong they're thinking and how wrong their speech is.
Right.
Instead
And
of, it's bees. Oh, sorry. It's like it's the bees with the honey thing. You attract more bees with honey.
right, and I mean, that's not to say that there's no place for anger because, I mean, this, on the LGBT side of things, there's a lot of anger that is quite justified that
Hmm.
is just bubbling under the surface, and we're finally being able to express it. But at the same time, you can't fault people who are just who have been taught a certain thing is right and another thing is wrong, and they're just doing what they think is right. You've gotta find a middle ground. You gotta I mean, there's this idea that's going around that, like, intentions don't matter, or,
Mhm.
they don't matter compared to impact, and, I mean, there's some truth to that. Like, if you accidentally step on somebody's foot, that foot's still gonna hurt. It's not,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
no matter how many times you say sorry, it's still, "Ow, that hurts," but you can still, like, not vilify that person, you know?
Right. Yeah, because they didn't do it on purpose. There is a difference.
Exactly.
There's a distinction between I stepped on your foot on accident and I kicked you in the foot to hurt you.
Exactly, and this is the thing that you see, like, on Facebook and Twitter and all that. They act like you did it on purpose and because you're just an evil person and you just hate us all, and, I don't know. I wonder if I'm just kind of an outlier in that way because I don't wanna see people as inherently just evil and out to get me.
Right.
Like,
No,
I
I don't think you're an outlier actually.
yeah.
I think it's that the people who are the other way that you described are just louder.
Yeah, it's a very loud minority, probably.
It is, and I think it's also that because that minority is so loud, that the people who are reasonable and open to a conversation, like hopefully you and I,
Mhm.
are less likely to comment on that thread and say something in attempt to moderate, an attempt to find common ground, because then they're worried that they'll be lumped in with the person who's the wrong thinker,
Yeah, and
or
it seems like wasting your breath kind of, because
yeah,
that person's not gonna
that
change.
too.
They're just
Yep.
gonna get louder,
Right. Yep.
so there's
Yeah.
no real point.
Yeah, I agree. It's an interesting phenomenon, and I think again, it's just attached to the fact that most of these conversations don't occur
Mhm.
in person. They
Yeah.
occur in this like I've got to type my point into 140 characters or 280 now or whatever on Twitter, and
Mhm.
or if anyone's going to read this Facebook post, it's going to have to be relatively brief. So I've got to get my shot in. Um,
Yeah, and if no one can see my face, I can be as nasty and mean as I want, you
yep.
know?
Yep.
Yeah. It's like the customer who, like, yells angrily at the employee in the retail shop. They're never gonna see that person again, they're never gonna interact with them again, so they get to take out all of their life's anger on that person, and I think it's the same thing with these keyboard warriors.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because like you mentioned a second ago, that there is justification for anger, and I
Yes.
agree.
Yeah.
I agree because injustice does happen.
Mhm.
However, a lot there's this concept in kind of philosophy and psychology that expresses the idea that you shouldn't attribute to malice what you can attribute to circumstances.
Mhm. Yeah.
Meaning your as your default reaction, it should be that person just hurt my feelings. That person just wronged me. I shouldn't assume that it's because they wanted to. I should assume that
Yes.
there's some kind of circumstance behind what caused that, because that's probably more accurate.
Right,
Um,
that's kinda like how I view most things,
yeah, it's
I
healthier.
mean yeah, and I mean, to be honest, it probably does get me in some situations where I get kinda, beat up on or whatever, but I would rather have that and just give people the benefit of the doubt, even if it gets me hurt more, than to, like, cause unnecessary hurt to
Mhm.
someone who was not intending to be, mean or anything.
Right, and I think I feel like it also depends on what your goals are.
Mhm.
Meaning, like to use again the example of sometimes there are reasons to be angry, and there are justified expressions of kind of righteous anger, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true,
Mhm.
but still, even in those instances, I guess I'm more of a person who tries to be zen about like all things. But like if my goal is to soften the heart of that person,
Mhm.
even if I feel like my anger towards them is justified, I
Mhm.
always again I think back to my story that I told about my choir teacher. I think about like if my goal is to actually bring that person over to my side on the issue, on being more loving or being more kind in expressing that, I know that I'm not going to do it even if my anger is justified. I won't get that person over to my side
Yeah.
if that's how I approach them.
Right. And see, I wonder if a lot of these people just are not getting anger out like at other times because I mean, there's gonna be that pent up anger that you must release at some point, and if you're only reminded of it when you're talking with somebody who just wants to understand, well, then it's more likely it's just gonna come all out on that person. It's just gonna this wave of anger is just gonna knock them over. And that's not they don't deserve that. So just that's one reason I really like music is because I can get that repressed stuff out in a
Yeah,
healthy manner.
yeah, no, I agree. And in fact, and in music too, I feel like we have opportunities, especially in ensemble music, but it's true in all types of music, I suppose. But in ensemble music, we get the opportunity to um, go beyond all of these aspects of identity that make us different,
Mhm.
and get to, because all those, I'm not poo pooing those things. All those things are
Oh,
part of who we are,
sure.
we can transcend them
Mhm.
in an ensemble and just be like all on the same team doing the same stuff, having the
Mhm.
same goal. And I think that's a beautiful thing, especially in of course this is geared towards choir concepts in the show, but like that's why I love choir, because
Right.
for that 1 hour
Mhm.
we're just all people uh,
Yes.
trying to rock out some Brahms or whatever,
Mhm.
and so I think that's an awesome thing, and I think that, so there's a time and a place maybe for some of that. Um, I guess being uptight about some of those conversations.
Right, and see, that's why choir being in a choir is so therapeutic for me,
Hmm.
because I've always kind of felt like an outsider. I've always been like that, but, when I'm in a room singing with all these other people, I feel like I'm in with with this whole room doing the same thing, and no one is gonna ostracize me or anything like that. We're all doing something that we love, and I do feel like I kinda get depressed if I'm not in an ensemble actively,
Yeah,
regularly.
yeah. I can't tell you how many times in my career as a teacher I've had students graduate from high school, and then a year later, 2 years later, I get a Facebook message out of nowhere. Oh my goodness, I miss choir. I don't have anything like that in my life anymore.
Mhm.
What do I do? Help me find a choir. Those types of things, and it does happen. At, on slightly veering back towards, since we're still talking about choir now, about this gendered language thing in choir. I have another idea to bounce off of you.
Uh-huh.
The idea that, like, this is actually a trend in the choral convention world now. There were, I feel like, 4 or 5 topic conversations on this at the recent ACDA National Convention, uh,
Mhm.
positing the idea that we shouldn't have things anymore called men's choirs. We shouldn't have women's choirs anymore. We should call them TTBB choirs, or SSA choirs. And I'm concerned with that on a couple levels, kind of like I was hinting at before. I never feel like a one step solution is enough for something, and so
Yeah.
I get like skeptical when lots and lots of people start to just feel like, oh, yep, that fixes it. That'll take care of it.
Well, a
Eh,
lot of it's kind of woven into the music that's written, that's arranged for those groups.
Right?
It's kind of like a, more masculine subject matter in the, tenor and bass choirs or more feminine sound in the SSA or whatever.
Hmm.
It's kind of already woven in. So just slapping a different label on it is not necessarily going to solve that.
Right, and
But it is
especially,
one step.
yes. So I feel like I always I'm trying to putting it in my kind of environment at the school I teach at, where if we've had a men's choir there for 60 years, something like that, and if it, let's say starting tomorrow, it was called the Lee Summit High School TTBB choir.
Mhm.
you know um, I feel like nothing would change in terms of the way that the young people in that ensemble identify.
Right.
Nothing's going to change with with the fact that they would still look at each other and think, "Hey, this is men's choir."
Mhm.
That would still be there, and also, like you said, I agree that the subject matter of most of the music would still be, because that's what's mostly been written over the years, that is one thing I also fully agree with most people who are critical of this, of gendered choral ensembles. That's a part I really agree with. We need music that helps boys uh, dive into that, I guess you could say, just to use the stereotypical language, more feminine side of themselves.
Yeah.
Um, I agree with that. My goodness, and I think so. I think that's one of the steps.
Mhm.
But at the same time, most of the boys, or the young people in that ensemble do identify as boys. Uh,
Yeah.
so I feel like removing that language completely could be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Um,
Possibly.
but sorry, this is a long thought, I know.
No,
Uh,
it's alright.
but I feel like if I do my job as the director, like
Mhm.
I should, which is to make connections on an individual level with as many of my students as possible, hopefully all of them, to the point where they know that I care about them as for who they are and for who they're going to be 10 years from now
Mhm.
enough, and would accept them enough to where, if even if in my quote men's choir I
Mhm.
had a student who uh, deep down felt like, well, I'm a girl,
Mhm.
would be able to express that to me, and or would it, even if they didn't feel comfortable expressing it to me, because a lot of high school kids would just be scared, out of their mind to do that, but would feel like, even if I didn't tell Mr. Muntz,
Mhm.
like I know he'd be fine. Like he would,
Yeah.
he's not going to judge me, to the point where maybe some of those idiosyncratic language changes would be less important than just the human interaction that you
Right.
have.
Exactly. And, I wonder if some of it, how much of it is kind of more performative, how much of it is just to make the people in charge look better and how much is actually taking action. And I think there is some overlap with that,
Ding, ding,
because
ding.
yeah, because
Yeah.
language is important, but
Mhm.
it's not the only thing that we can change.
Right, and that's really the core of my point. Actually, is that it's not that I'm opposed to the idea wholesale that you should not call it men's choir, although
Right.
I think there's some value in doing that. Although I also see some value in not doing that. Like I see both sides of it. It's just that I think it can't be a sticker that you throw on the name of the choir, and not do the other stuff, where
Yes.
you're developing those relationships to the point where it wouldn't matter if you were calling it men's choir or if you were calling it women's choir and they were all boys. Like if
Right.
because ultimately, if you knew that, like, hey, that's just Mr. Muntz, he's weird, you know,
Yeah.
uh, then it would be less of a big deal. I think really what I'm kind of driving at, my goal in when I talk to people, is to try to make those types of things less drama inducing and more conversation starting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, it seems like it's something that needs to be changed more from the root than from the surface.
Hmm.
Just stick a band-aid on a wound, it's still gonna fester. So, you gotta actually treat the problem at the source.
Hmm.
So, and that's gonna take more than just putting new labels on things. So,
I wonder your opinion on this. I think one of the things I noticed is that all across the country, even in Kansas City, we have the Heartland Men's Chorus, and there are gay men's choruses all over the country that are super accepting and open to all
mhm,
people. And they have women who sing tenor sometimes. They
mhm,
have trans men. All kinds of, like, it just, that because their welcome mat, so to speak, is makes it obvious that, if Theo, the new baritone,
mhm.
wanted to be in that group, they would totally accept you,
Yeah,
and like they would totally want you to be in there, and there would be no stigma, and there would be no judgment. But yet, it's still called a men's choir.
right. Well, I
Thoughts about that?
I mean, I don't know, it seems kinda I don't know, it seems just kinda like that's the predominant population in the choir.
Right.
So, maybe that's what it's pointing to more than anything. And I mean, there may be a history behind that name that, they want to preserve.
Hmm. Do you think so? I agree. Do you think that's bad?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like it isn't either. Because I think it has more to do with what's on. What signals are you sending as far as um, your level of accepting people for who they are.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, it's predominantly gay men, but,
mhm.
anyone can join if they want.
Well, yeah,
So,
straight men, straight.
yeah,
They have some straight men in there,
yeah,
and so I think that's an interesting take on it because I think in the choral profession, you mentioned the word performative, and I kind of see it that way too, in the sense that it's like um, if we do this one little linguistic change, then we will demonstrate that we are accepting. Um,
right,
and I think ultimately that's not the kind of accepting that people really deep down want.
right. You can talk
But,
the talk, but can you walk the walk?
right, the Twitter or the Twitter or the like you said keyboard warriors. That's the kind they want because they want to see on paper all of those things look right, but deep down it's really about the conversations.
Yep. Conversations that maybe they don't want to have because they don't want to admit the places where they're wrong.
Yeah, or even acknowledge that their ideas maybe might not be fully thought out or um,
Yeah.
fully fleshed out, and that's the unfortunate thing when people aren't willing to have a conversation about stuff like that. Is that in fact, the episode right before yours, I talked a little bit about how nobody knows everything. Like there's
Exactly.
no one person knows everything, and then we get better at thinking by talking with each other.
Yes, and I mean, I got to admit that I have an issue with that. I think it's probably like gifted kid syndrome or something. Because when I was a kid, I always was like seen as the so-called smart kid. So I have a problem. Admittedly, I don't like being wrong, but you have to break through that in order to learn more things. What is
Mhm.
what is that quote where it's just like I know I'm intelligent because I know I don't know anything?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think I don't know the exact quote you're talking about, but yeah, I understand that concept
Mhm.
is
The
kind of
more
like
you know,
a
the more
mantra.
there is to know.
And the more you know, the more you know you don't know.
Exactly.
Um, yeah, I do. This is a podcast, so I can't do like a visual demonstration for the audience, but I do this thing with my students where I draw a small circle on the board. When they need to be motivated, I do lots of philosophy, as you can probably guess.
Yeah.
So I'll draw this small circle on the board, and I'll say, "All right, guys, this is you now, and
Mm,
how much you know about the world."
mhm.
No offense, but it's a pretty small circle. And then I'll after that I'll draw on a slightly bigger circle outside of that smaller circle, and I'll say, all right, this is going to be you after college.
Yep.
You're going to know a little bit more, but as you can see, there's still quite a bit of board out there.
Mhm.
And then I'll draw like a really big, like arm's length circle around college, and I'll say, okay, this is going to be you at about age 35, only at about that point will you start to recognize how much more of the board you haven't even explored. Uh,
Yes.
and then I'll always draw some kind of star at some point way out on the edge of the board, where I'll say, and at that point, you're going to realize what makes you you.
Yep.
And at this point you probably haven't even encountered that yet. It's not even in your circle. There's so much more to learn, and so the reality is we expand our circle only by talking about things that we think, and
Mhm.
and if we can't do that, we won't do that if we don't feel like we're safe to bounce our ideas off of someone who might think of something different than us. uh,
Yeah.
you know
I think there is kind of that expectation that, everybody has to know everything about whatever they're talking about. You see this with fandoms, like, say you like a Zelda game. Well, you must have played every single game and you must know all the trivia and all that. Why can't you just enjoy the game?
right.
What and to be honest, I don't know that I would ever if there was like a magical way where I could know everything there was to know, I would not take that. because that would just take the fun out of life. The fun is in learning.
Yeah, it's the journey. Like if you've started the path, then you're in the right place.
Mhm.
That's what you have to move forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is fun. I think these conversations are so important, and I wanted to have you chat with me on this because mostly because in the choir world, it's an area that I'm really passionate about. It's a profession that I take very seriously,
Mhm.
and I see some of those types of divisions that happen mostly online,
Mhm.
but I see it starting to affect the my profession too, and and that at that point I'm like, okay, no, we need to, even if, like, my podcast is pretty darn new, not I don't have a lot of people listening to it yet, but even if
Mhm.
the people who listen to the show will start to carve out a little part of their life that's more about understanding and more about seeking to understand
Mhm.
than about criticizing people online, I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much for coming on. I'm gonna leave you. We've been chatting for over an hour. It's awesome. I love it.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah,
Yeah, thanks for having me.
yeah. I want to leave you with one little scenario, and if it's okay, if it brings you into another area of thought. Um,
Okay.
so, let's say you were one of my high school choir students,
Mhm.
and you were, it's just a thought experiment, and you, instead of discovering that you were meant to be a man
Mhm.
in your later years or in your adult years, let's say you discovered it when you were 14,
Mhm.
and mom and dad were supportive, and like a lot of kids nowadays are discovering, their parents will support them, and
Mhm.
and you started taking hormones, and you started that whole process earlier in your life,
Mhm.
and let's say by your junior year in high school, your voice had kind of dropped to where it is now, and your voice is functioning because it's increased in size. It's functioning more like a baritone.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and let's say you um, you make it into one of our select men's ensembles,
Mhm.
and then at that year, as the director, I decide to neuter the language
Mhm.
and take out references to men and the men's choir.
Mhm.
What do you, did I just pull the rug out from under your feet in the sense of all that you'd accomplished to try to become a man?
Hmm. I don't think so, because I would be thinking about other trans people who maybe had not come out,
Uh-huh.
because I had been there before, and I know it's not all about me, and, I know that I'm still a guy,
Mhm.
and, the name of an ensemble is not going to change that, and I'm still, physically, I've still alleviated my dysphoria as much as I can,
Right.
and so, I've done my part, and I'm happy with that. So, I don't know, and I know that, like, people will come out later in life and, maybe I don't know, I would just think about the ways in which I was lucky, in my own journey
Mhm.
and the ways in which other people were not,
Yeah,
and
that's
try to
that's
empathize.
yeah, I think that's great. Now, I want to clarify a little bit of my question too. Like, let's say, because you mentioned the name of the ensemble. Let's forget about the name of the ensemble. Let's say that was not, that didn't matter. But let's say
Right.
I refuse to refer to you in a rehearsal setting as one of the guys, or um, or a young man, or
Oh.
all those types of things, because I'm trying really hard not to use gendered language.
Oh, like me in particular.
Yeah, you in particular, but let's say you're standing with a group of three or four boys, and the other ones are cisgendered, and here's what I'm worried about is that I'm worried about, like, if I get that kid in that situation,
Mhm.
that one of the things deep down that they might want is to be one of the guys.
Right, to, like, be validated as one
Yeah,
of the
and
guys.
if all of a sudden I take that out of that culture in that ensemble,
Mhm.
because it's part of the culture in the ensemble, that for a lot of the cisgendered boys, that actually is what attracts them to the culture.
Uh-huh.
And so I guess I'm kind of worried about how that would affect the cisgendered boys, but also how it would affect the trans boy who just worked their butt off, for 2 or 3 years, not only to achieve the level of musicianship that they need to achieve to get in there, but also to change their whole physical,
Yeah.
apparatus. I don't know. I think about it in a very heterodox way, I guess.
Right. Well, I could see why that could be distressing and why, I would crave that validation. But
Hmm.
I think it would depend on how well you knew the ensemble.
Hmm.
Like if you knew that like all of us identified as guys, then why not just say, "All right, you guys, why don't you sing this?" You know?
Yeah, I love that. See, yeah, I agree because that's kind of that's my instinct also is
Yeah,
that it should be about the kids in front of you, not
exactly. It's
not about some blanket policy.
right because and then that also makes it feel like you're talking to us in particular, and we're not just like a few random faces. You know?
Yes, yeah, like by matter of policy, I will address you as, it seems disingenuous, to me, and so I feel I stress about that a little bit, even though I know it's a very rare scenario.
Yeah.
But I still stress about it because I'm really into those kind of thought experiments and just trying because it helps me distill kind of what my my principles are,
Hmm.
in that sense, which I think is very helpful. And I appreciate your insight into that because like I said at the beginning of the episode, I can't really know what that's like, um,
Hmm.
but at the same time, I can kind of ask for as much insight as I possibly can. So let's. I want to leave with you giving us a little bit of maybe your advice. So let's kind of taking my previous example of that high school student, and it could be a trans person of a high school student of any stripe. Um, what's your advice for that kid that might be going through a high school choir program that might be running into some of the difficulties of dysphoria or not knowing where they fit in?
Hmm. Well, I think that more than anything, that place should be a refuge for you. It should be a place where you can just be who you are and express yourself. And so you need to be as comfortable as you can be. So, you know, it's probably best to get to the root of the situation and just like talk with your director if you feel comfortable and just kind of come up with a solution, I suppose.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I agree. I think
It's a very individual thing.
it is, and the reality is that's why so many teenagers are scared to just come out and talk about it, let alone with their parents, but let alone with their teachers.
Yeah.
And so it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about how our job, I think, as choir directors, especially when we're dealing with those kids, is
Hmm.
to send the message as frequently and as often in as many ways as we possibly can, that even though I might have someone out there in the choir who does not fit a particular mold or model that everyone considers air quotes normal,
Hmm.
you're still a part of this choir, and
Yes.
you are important and you're valuable. And if we do that job as choir directors, I think a lot of these other barriers will fall like scales from our eyes.
Yeah, you gotta just get to know the kids you are teaching, those individuals, and I think it will probably fall into place from there, especially since we're getting more comfortable just talking about this in general.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's so awesome. I appreciate you coming on so much, and this has been
Yeah.
a blast of a conversation. I think I could probably do this for another hour or two, but I've got to go make sure my kids have not burned down the house from the basement. So thank you so much for coming on, and this has been fun. And thank you for your insights.
Yeah, well, thank you.
All right. Have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of what was my longest episode so far, and I think you can hear why. That was a very engaging conversation with Theo, and I was enjoying it. I probably could have let that go on for 2 more hours, I think, and I would have been having a blast. But thanks anyway for sticking through that, and I hope you got something out of it. At least got some food for thought for your ensembles and how you would approach students that have uh, a different usage of gender terminology than maybe you grew up with, I know that is definitely going to be true for me as I start to, as Theo said, uh, adjust the language that we use, because we all have what we have in terms of language. Just a reminder that you can support the show on Patreon now. That's relatively recent. For $3 a month, you can get access to some off-channel content, including, after Theo and I signed off from that episode, we continued to talk a little bit more about the accusatory gotcha culture on the internet, which I think is a fascinating conversation that I did not include in the episode. But if you are a subscriber on Patreon for $3 a month, you can have access to that and other conversations that I might have with my guests that are off the main channel. For $5 a month, you can get all of that plus a Choralosophy t-shirt, which you can find a picture of on the website for this episode, and it's an awesome gray t-shirt that shows that you are a choralosopher. Don't forget also, join the Choralosophers Facebook page and head over to ryanmain.com and sightreadingfactory.com and check out those awesome online vendors for choral resources, and use the checkout code Choralosophy to get 10% off. Thanks again for listening, and we will catch you next time on the Choralosophy Podcast.